Hello everyone. Today I will be covering slides 10 through 19 in your evolution notes. We will be continuing from where we left off with the first cells. I will be mainly focusing on the early ideas of evolution and the scientists that were involved with that. But first I will talk about the formal definition of evolution. But before we get to all of that, I do want to briefly recap the first cells. Now, just to recall, we started in the very beginning with very simple prokaryotic cells that were heterotropic. Eventually, we get autotropic prokaryotic cells, meaning they can make their own food. We first had ones that did chemiosynthesis, and later we get ones that can do photosynthesis. Eventually, we move away from those simple prokaryotic cells and we get the first eukaryotic cells, which happened through that process of endosymbiosis, which is explained by endosymbiotic theory, and that smaller prokaryotic cells were engulfed by larger prokaryotic cells. Those smaller prokaryotic cells became the modern mitochondria and chloroplasts that we see today in eukaryotes. Again, eukaryotic cells, those are more complex. They have a nucleus, they have membrane-bound organelles, versus prokaryotic cells are much more simple. They don't have membrane-bound organelles and they don't have a nucleus. Just to recap what we previously had talked about. Now let's move on to the formal definition of evolution and what it is. So this is the process of biological change by which descendants come to differ from their ancestors. So over time, we're seeing changes in a population over multiple generations. And we're talking about the phenotype, so physical characteristics, which of course relates directly to genotype, the DNA and genes that are being passed on between different generations. Now, this change in the inherited characteristics, as I said before, occurs within a population. So we're seeing a population change over time, over multiple generations. And this is super important. Populations evolve, individuals do not. Which brings me to this image right here. This is a very popular image. Most of you have probably seen this in media or at some point in your life, and it's the monkey to man. And the reason I don't like this is I feel it's not very representative of what evolution is. It's not this linear line. We did not evolve from chimpanzees. Rather, we share a common ancestor with them. And at some point we diverged and us as humans went one way and they went a different way. So just to be clear on that, and again, it's not an individual that changes over time. It's a population overall, which is a group of the same species living in an area. Now, one of the main driving forces that explains for evolution is what we're seeing in terms of what we can observe. We see populations changing over time in terms of phenotype and certain traits and characteristics. And the main driving force behind this is natural selection, which we will talk a lot more about later on. But essentially, it is the mechanism or the process by which individuals that have inherited beneficial adaptations, meaning they have the best traits in order to survive in a particular environment, are one, going to survive, and two, going to have more offspring on average than other individuals who might struggle to survive or might not survive at all. And if they're the ones that are having offspring that are surviving, are going to pass on those traits to their offspring. And over time, as those traits get passed on, we can see a change in the population. Oftentimes, this is called survival of the fittest, which most of you may have heard before. And just to be clear, it's not the fastest, the strongest individual. It is the individual that has the best traits in order to survive in a particular environment, whatever that may be. So that is evolution in a nutshell. We'll go more in depth with natural selection later on. So let's talk about some of the early ideas of evolution and some of those scientists that were involved. So in the 1700s, the common belief was that species were permanent and unchanging. All the species you had were what you had and they wouldn't change at all. And that the Earth was only a few thousand years old. We know today that the Earth is about 4.5 billion years old. Charles Darwin had a counter belief to that, so he thought that species have been continuously changing over time, which is evolution. He does coin the term evolution, but he only uses it once. It's not a word that he uses very often. He prefers to use the definition descent with modification, which I'll get to a little bit more later on. And he further developed his ideas in the 17th and 18th century with the help of other scientists, geologists, and naturalists. He himself was a naturalist, meaning he studied and observed nature and collected various plants and animals on his journeys that I'll talk more about later. So let's talk about some scientists that influenced Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin, he is one of the main people we associate with evolution, but there were other scientists involved that influenced him, and there's also another scientist that was working on the same idea at the same time as him. So the first person is Charles Lyell. He was a geologist, so he studied rocks and Earth's surface, and he is credited with this theory called uniformitarianism. So, really long word, but this is an idea that, or a theory that states geological processes that shape Earth are uniform and constant throughout time, meaning that the processes, the rock cycle of rocks eroding and weathering because of things like wind and rain, and then sediments being deposited and forming rock layers, has been the same throughout time. And we can find evidence in certain fossils and various strata layers. Again, another word to describe those layers of rock. And we can find the oldest at the bottom, of course, and the newest at the top. And Darwin really liked this idea because it showed how organisms gradually changed over time. And again, fossils are something that don't always occur to an organism if they die. The conditions do have to be right in order for a fossil to form and get preserved. But those fossils that have been preserved, those organisms that we can study, over time we can see how they change based on where they're at in those various layers of rock. Our next scientist is Georges Cuvier. He also studied fossils and he did a lot of reconstruction of those fossils. And one thing that he noted was some species became extinct at certain layers. And this promoted the idea of catastrophism. So this is the idea that sudden geological or catastrophic change would cause a mass extinction. So this could be anything from volcanoes, floods, earthquakes, meteorites, asteroids, and what he saw was there was an organism or a fossil in a particular layer of rock, but then you don't see it at all in the next layer. And he thought this had to be caused by some type of catastrophic event. We also have another scientist, Nicholas Steno, and he is known for what we call the law of superposition. So this law states a couple of different things. So one, layers of rock are deposited on top of each other by wind and water. And of course, the oldest layers being at the bottom and the newest layers being at the top. And different organisms or fossils that were preserved in these rock layers would be different in each layer. We can see where they lived or what time they lived according to those rock layers. And organisms that were in the same layer tend to be more similar to each other, and rock or fossils that were in different layers tend to be more different from each other. And the disappearance of a fossil for a particular organism was often due to a mass extinction, as we just talked about with Cuvier. So again, this could be due to volcano, flood, earthquake. Most of you are probably thinking of the dinosaurs, for instance. So the most prevalent theory for how the dinosaurs went extinct is that there was a very large meteorite that hit the Earth, and it caused a huge change in Earth's climate, which ultimately caused the dinosaurs to go extinct, and thus bringing in the age of the mammals. So a lot of the same concepts here in terms of Earth's layers of rock and how these scientists studied them and influenced Darwin and his ideas. I do have another scientist to talk about that also influenced Darwin, but he wasn't correct in his explanation, and ultimately his ideas were rejected. So Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, he thought that the mechanism for evolution was that there are traits that are acquired. Now, what are acquired traits or characteristics? So he thought that these traits or characteristics were acquired by an experience or behavior and therefore would be passed on to offspring. So one of his most notable examples is that, say a giraffe is stretching its neck in order to reach up higher branches. And he thought that if that giraffe stretches its neck, then when it has offspring, those offspring will have longer necks. Now, let's just think about this for a second. This is very similar to saying, let's say I am someone who practices being very flexible and I'm a gymnast and I can do the splits. That would be saying, though, if I have children, that my children will be able to do that, which we know is not true. So his ideas were ultimately rejected. And he also thought that if certain traits were not used, that they would disappear. Now, how he explained this was incorrect, but he did influence Darwin in that traits are inherited and are driven by changes in the environment. However, Darwin took a different approach in terms of how he explained this. So in the next video, I'll talk about Darwin's ideas and also this other scientist that was involved that had the same ideas as Darwin at the same time.